17.4 million people voted for Brexit. That is the largest mandate any political decision has ever had. Now, many people in Britain would always have voted for Brexit, those people who believe in democracy and sovereignty and issues like that. What put the Leave campaign over the top were non-voters who politics had left behind, who thought politics could do nothing for them. This is their story. We start in 1945. This is Victory in Europe Day. As you can see, we have the royal family waving. The crowds cheered. In the middle is Winston Churchill. When he waved, the crowd went wild. 82% approval rating, the highest ever. He was a great prime minister and war leader, and yet 2 months later, he lost a general election badly. Now, the reason he lost to this man, Clement Attlee, about whom he once said, a modest man with a lot to be modest about, despite the fact that the polls and the press and even Joseph Stalin had predicted Churchill would win, was lost on many people until some researchers went around the country to try and find out. They met with people of both working class and middle class as well, and they found that those people just wanted change, a change in their personal circumstances. They also felt that politics and politicians had left them behind. They felt Churchill offered a continuation of this. Clement Attlee offered something different. This is based upon the experience of the UK during the 1930s depression. During this time, economically, the government did very little. People were left to starve. People were left without jobs for a long time. In America, meanwhile, the economist John Maynard Keynes had managed to influence FDR to introduce the New Deal to build infrastructure and to create jobs. But in Britain, not much happened. After the war, they looked at their personal circumstances again and saw that more of the same was going to happen, and they were going to continue as they were. During the war, Winston Churchill had asked a man named William Beveridge to create a report on how to rebuild the country. He decided that the best way to rebuild the country was to rid it of the 5 giant evils of want, disease, squalor, idleness, and ignorance. John Maynard Keynes had written a book about full employment and the importance of everybody having the dignity of employment. Clement Attlee, in his manifesto, Let Us Face the Future, had talked of implementing those things. Winston Churchill hadn't. What's interesting is that the people that the researchers spoke to didn't know, many of them, what Attlee was offering. They just wanted a change in their personal circumstances, whatever happened. Now, the reason Clement Attlee was able to do the things that he did, and let's face it, the people who wanted change got pretty lucky. They got the welfare state, they got the NHS, they got hundreds of thousands of houses built. The commanding heights of production were nationalised, so people got their needs. The reason he was able to do that was because there were 2 things missing. One, globalisation hadn't happened. Many countries were rebuilding. What we produced didn't have to compete with cheaper and sometimes better imports. But also, we weren't present at this. This is Robert Schuman. This is the signing of the Schuman Declaration. It was creating the European coal and steel community. This was the forerunner of the European community as we know it. Now, what they created, and Britain wasn't involved in this because Clement Attlee and his Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin had decided not to be involved, was something called a supranational authority that had authority over national governments, that could say whether coal mines would be closed or whether production should be got down here or here. If you're building a socialist Jerusalem, as Clement Attlee was doing, you don't want people interfering. So, what then happened was a post-war consensus that nobody would be left behind. We would have full employment, so the government would intervene for the greater good. And this post-war consensus lasted through the cheap imports that happened in the early 1950s as countries that had been ravaged by war came back online. It lasted through the end of rationing. Even the Conservatives, as Harold Macmillan, on the left as you look at the screen here, he was the Conservative Prime Minister from 1957 to 1963. In 1961, unemployment after 10 years of Conservative rule, was about 300,000. They were building hundreds of thousands of houses. He was building the M1 motorway. Full employment and the post-war consensus had held. No one was left behind. Now, there's a reason I've included the man on the left in his picture. The man on the right, as you look at it, that is Charles de Gaulle. Because it was at this point, about 1961, Harold Macmillan decided we would join Europe. What we tried to do was join Europe without losing our links to the Commonwealth and without losing our links to America. To which de Gaulle said, no. In 1967, Harold Wilson, this is the next Prime Minister, tried to do it too. He didn't even get to have a meeting with Charles de Gaulle because Charles de Gaulle simply said no again. So we arrived at 1970s with the post-war consensus holding. And what then happened was that it fell apart. The 1970s was a decade of great chaos, and it was caused by four things. Firstly, full employment and the consequences of that. Secondly, globalization. Thirdly, the EU. And fourthly, what happened with oil prices. I'm going to start with the unions. If you have full employment, eventually you recognize that you own the scarce resource. The unions got increasingly powerful, and despite Labour Party attempts to deal with them, there was a report in 1968 called In Place of Strife, when they were trying to reach a deal with the unions didn't necessarily agree to pay restraint. If the unions put up wages, then firms put up wages, and you ended up with a bit of a spiral. Edward Heath, who's the man in the middle, tried to deal with this as well in the Industrial Relations Act of 1972. It's fair to say he was very swiftly rebuffed. Globalization was also causing a problem as well. The whole point of full employment is this. If everybody's got a job, they spend more money. If they spend more money, more firms get more money and hire more people. And it's a virtuous circle. It's actually called the multiplier. The problem was, other countries were beginning to produce products that were cheaper and higher quality, and British people were buying those. These are leakages from our economy. The third thing that happened was that Edward Heath decided to take us into the European community, as it was at the time, without a referendum. And when he did that, a few things happened. So one of the things you have to do when you enter the European community, you have to accept something called the Acquis Communautaire. And the Acquis Communautaire is the series of declarations and treaties which everybody has agreed. On the morning of Britain and Ireland and Norway and Denmark's applications being received at 9 a.m., they were received at 12, at 9 a.m., the 6 countries, Germany, Italy, France, Belgium, Netherlands and Luxembourg, agreed the common fisheries policy, realizing that the countries that were trying to join owned 4/5 of the fish. And they decided that, let's pool all the fish as well. So because they signed that at 9, at 12 o'clock, the countries that were trying to get in had to accept it. The common fisheries policy, which we had to accept because we carried on joining. Norway, by the way, had a referendum and didn't join. The common fisheries policy meant that our fishermen, who had done pretty well, suddenly had to share their waters with others. Fishermen are the first people that got properly left behind and let down by government. This was to come back to haunt us in a picture you see later. The other thing that happened, we had to accept the common agricultural policy. What that meant was a system of what's called European preference. European preference was that we buy European imports instead of Commonwealth imports, and we do that by taxing Commonwealth imports. That meant our food prices went up. When food prices went up, union pay demands went up, which makes sense, I suppose. So we've got this situation, and then into that we bring the oil crisis. And this was basically started by the Arab countries angry with Israel's behavior and the support for Israel's behavior of the Western world, deciding to reduce their supply of oil, which quadrupled the oil price. As the oil price went up, again, food and energy prices went up, and again, there needed to be higher pay. Because this wasn't able to be afforded, bear in mind, the government was employing a lot of people. There were strikes, and the government wasn't ready for it. And in 1973, we had a 3-day week. So a 3-day week was where there was only enough energy for firms to work for 3-day weeks. This got worse. We ended up having to go to the International Monetary Fund, yes, like Greece, 1976, for a loan. In 1978, this is Leicester Square. This is called the Winter of Discontent. So this was further union issues where, because of the impact of the International Monetary Fund and the cuts in public spending, the industrial strife continued, and the country became called the sick man of Europe. It was our crack-up moment. Into this rode a white knight. Her name was Thatcher. Now, Margaret Thatcher's idea was to create a freedom, a free market in goods and services. She wanted to sell off these nationalised companies and let them be exposed to competition. Another thing she did was in 1979, she relaxed exchange controls. So exchange controls were that you couldn't take more than £50 out of the country. This meant lots of people could go on holiday. This meant that the British seaside, all these seaside towns which have been doing incredibly well, Skegness, Blackpool, the holiday destinations of some of the people in this room in their childhood, suddenly began to go and suddenly began to decline. And the government did nothing because the government weren't picking winners anymore. The government weren't subsidising places that were losing out. They were ignored even as they declined, and it meant that there was no jobs for people who'd lost them, and the seaside towns have remained in decline even now. But it wasn't just that. At the time, we were sometimes paying £100 to get out £20 worth of coal. I've got Margaret Thatcher meeting some miners because, as many of you will know, the decision was made to stop subsidising coal. Now, I am not commenting on the economic justification for these policies, because overall they might have made sense, but they affected people's lives. Mining communities, like the docks in Liverpool, like other places in the country, they were built around the industry that they served. Thatcher's idea was, if you shut a mine or if you shut a factory, people would go and get another job. They would skill themselves up to do something else. They would move. The trouble is, many people who worked down a mine had been to secondary modern, had not got huge skills that could be used in services, and also they weren't prepared to move. They had their community. Norman Tebbit, who was the Trade and Industry Secretary in 1992, said they should get on their bike, but as it was, some of them weren't willing to, some of them weren't able to. There were other options. There could have been a major investment in education to help people reskill in other jobs. There could have been subsidizing of factories and other alternative employment to go where these communities were. This didn't happen. These people were left behind and forgotten. This caused huge regional inequality. Places all over the country started to go into decline. So Merthyr Tydfil in Wales, there's people who've been unemployed for 40 years. Meanwhile, in London, the banking community had been deregulated in 1986. As part of that, the Single European Act had meant Margaret Thatcher, in order to stop regulations from Europe on the banking sector, had agreed to drop the veto. So we used to have a veto. We could turn down any law we didn't want. She agreed to drop the veto, thinking this would be in the best interest of the financial services group. Now, they provide huge amounts of exports. That is, by the way, what mobile phones looked like in the mid-80s. They provide huge amounts of exports. They provide huge amounts of GDP. But if you're in a place where you don't have jobs anymore, and if you're in a place where you've been abandoned, you saw all this money and all this, these rich people in London, and you thought, this is a little bit unfair. However, no matter, Labour was going to come to the rescue. It took a while, but Tony Blair saw the future. New Labour, he said. New Britain. Now, the problem is, after 18 years of conservative rule, Tony Blair was just, and I think the Labour Party at whole, just sort of wanted to win. And in order to win, they had to allay some fears of the people who hadn't voted for Labour for a long time. So they accepted conservative spending plans. So they accepted there would be no income tax rises. They did some great policies. The national minimum wage. Many say that was set too low. The Disability Discrimination Act, civil partnerships, human rights law. But what they didn't do was they didn't redistribute And they only tackled the margins of people excluded. What they didn't have was a plan to tackle those people who'd been left behind by politics. But that's not really why people got so angry. These yellow countries are the accession countries into Europe in the early 2000s. So mostly you've got Eastern European countries, you've got Malta, you've got Cyprus. They applied and were accepted to join the EU. Tony Blair and the Labour government were offered the opportunity to have what are known as transition controls. So it would take 7 years to assimilate migrants, they could control the access, they could move them to different places. They hired a professor to do a project which would tell them how many Eastern Europeans would come to this country, or how many Europeans would come to this country. He said 13,000 if Germany doesn't have transition controls, if France doesn't have transition controls. If every other country does the same as Britain, it would be 13,000. Instead, that 13,000 figure somehow leaked out without his caveat. So it became a bit of a surprise, obviously, when about 3 million people came. Now, I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but I want to make something very clear. Nobody voted for this. Huge changes to the country, nobody voted for. And the impact were on people who politics had already left behind. And let's look at the impact on inequality. The Gini coefficient is a measure of inequality. It's between 0 and 1. 1977 or 8, it was at 0.24. That's the same as Denmark, except we were all equally poor. After, this is where Thatcher left. So it's gone up by 10, and it's about where we are now. So as you can see, the impact of Tony Blair was very little. Inequality, when you see other people being successful when you're not, it can make you angry. Next, I want to show you this. This is the British workforce by industry. So as you can see, manufacturing, which used to be about 10 million people, has now gone down to about 2. Services has grown hugely. Different skills are needed there. But also, and this is important to think about, if you're a miner, you're paid quite a lot because you had a specialist job. If you go and work, so now if you're working in steel, if you're asked to work in a call centre, you're being paid 1/3 of what you used to be paid. It's not that simple to do. I want to come back to immigration, because this is important. In 1948, we sent boats over to the Caribbean because we'd lost a lot of our young males to the war, and we needed people to come over and help rebuild the country. 500,000 people came. It was from the Caribbean and from Asia as well. The country wasn't asked about this, but most people actually accepted it needed to happen. But it did change some communities. The key thing is that nobody was asked. 1968, East African Indians were expelled from Uganda and Kenya and places like that. They came to this country too, most of them highly educated. Again, the country wasn't asked. Now, Eastern European immigration brought 3 million people. There has never been a mandate for that. Nigel Farage has said, if in a 2001 manifesto, Tony Blair had said, I am going to not have transition controls for these countries, and then was voted in, he had a mandate. There has never been a mandate for mass immigration, and it affects people. I'm going to very quickly explain this graph, but this graph explains a lot. If you lined up the whole world in terms of how much they earn per year, this person here is at 80. That means 80% of the population earn less than them. This is the real increase in income over 20 years from 1988 to 2008. These are the people who are working class in developed countries. They are the only people in the world whose real income has fallen during this time. Why? Because much of their jobs were outsourced, because competition was allowed and globalization was taking place to these countries. These are the middle class in China. As you can see, they've done very well. But also, people came to Britain. Basic economics suggests that if the supply in your industry of what you do increases, then your wages will fall. There is a wonderful series of films by John Harris in The Guardian, yes, The Guardian, pro-immigration Guardian, called Anywhere But Westminster. And they're worth watching because you can meet Dave from South Shields. In 2004, he's a builder, he was earning £3 an hour more than he is now. The question he asks is, why am I earning £3 an hour? Why am I earning £3 an hour less now? It's because builders came to South Shields and made difference. And he said, and if I challenge this, and I'll come back to this in a minute, I was called racist. Also, we meet Tony from West Bromwich, worked in the steel industry. He doesn't have that job anymore because it was outsourced. School plate, you meet people who can't get their kids into school because of lots of people coming. You also see adverts in Peterborough for jobs with working conditions and pay so low that only people who come to this country from somewhere else with worse working conditions would ever accept it. You would expect Tony Blair to worry about this. I'm going to quote what he said in his conference speech of 2005. The pace of change can either overwhelm us or make our lives better and our country stronger. What we can't do is pretend it's not happening. I hear people say we have to stop and debate globalization. You might as well debate whether autumn should follow summer. The character of this changing world is indifferent to tradition, unforgiving of frailty, no respecter of past reputations. It has no custom and practice. It is replete with opportunities, but they only go to those swift to adapt, slow to complain, open, willing, and able to change. Most people are not like that. Swift to adapt, slow to complain, open, willing, and able to change. Most people in this country might not be not like that. What if these are the qualities now demanded of millions of Britons, what happens if they fail the test? The answer is that they were called lazy and racist. You weren't allowed to debate the impact of immigration in this country in the 2000s. It was banned. You were called a racist or a bigot. I'm speaking at the J.S. Mill Society. J.S. Mill had something to say about this. J.S. Mill was writing at a time you could be imprisoned for not having a belief in God, or believing differently to what was socially accepted could put a person outside the law. He gave the example of how Jesus and Socrates were once bad, now they're good. He said, when a society or a nation holds some principles beyond dispute or prevents discussion, we cannot hope to find that generally high scale of mental activity which has made some period of history so remarkable. No one listened to these people who politics had left behind. Everybody, every new person had made their lives worse. But some people were listening. At first, it was the BNP, led by Nick Griffin. Now, he was a Cambridge history graduate. He had some charisma. He could speak. But the problem was a lot of the policies that he had were unpalatable to a lot of the people who wanted something done. Many of them were left-wing. They weren't prepared to vote for the BNP. UKIP was different. Nigel Farage became leader in 2006 and quickly began to realise that a lot of the people attending his rallies and listening to him speak had left-wing views, were actually from the mining communities and from working class communities that were supposed to be Labour. In 2010, UKIP got 1 million voters, but were nowhere near a seat. But the coalition made a difference. This was Conservatives, had a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. It meant that David Cameron couldn't buy off Eurosceptic MPs, and they couldn't be made ministers. There was then a budget in 2012. It was called the Omni Shambles budget. And the polls were going low, and David Cameron started to worry. In January 2013, he stood up at Bloomberg, which is a business in the city, and said he would call an in-out referendum if the Conservatives were returned to government in 2015. Nigel Farage knew this was his chance. Why? Because a referendum is different. Everybody's votes means the same. But he knew he had to get people to vote who hadn't voted before. Now, Mahatma Gandhi once said, and I know that using Nigel Farage and Mahatma Gandhi in the same sentence isn't advisable, but I'm going to do it. Mahatma Gandhi once said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. In 2014, UKIP became the first political party, apart from Conservatives and Labour, since 1906 to win an election outright. 27.49% of the votes, about 30% turnout, So people ignored it. They said it's just a one-off and it's a protest vote. In 2015, if you have a look at this, UKIP got almost 4 million votes. They got more votes than the Lib Dems and the SNP put together. But they got 1 seat because of our election system. SNP got 56, Lib Dems got 8. So people laughed at them. The thing about the referendum is that your vote counts the same as David Cameron. Your vote counts the same as Richard Branson's. This is what happened during the referendum campaign. People who complained about their situation and said, this is our one chance, were fought. When fishermen, took Nigel Farage, I admit, but when fishermen came down the Thames to protest against their situation, Bob Geldof, multimillionaire, gathered a group together and literally stuck 2 fingers up at them. Then they won. And who's laughing now? Thank you. Now, Mr. Wallace is going to come round with a microphone. Who has questions?
Do you think Owen Smith's pledge for a live EU referendum is genuinely achievable?
Okay, so Owen Smith...
Obviously, given there's no chance of getting elected, do you think that a second referendum is a possibility?
I think the most important part of that question, if you can give the microphone back to Mr. Wallace, is about the second referendum. Is a second referendum possible? There are lots of views about this, and one of my favourite Twitter accounts, the UCL's Constitution Unit, which was really exciting, has looked at this, and the truth is there's no precedent. We voted only to withdraw from the EU. No one's voted for the replacement. The idea of referendums is for people to give consent to how they're governed. No one's given consent to how they're governed. It might be the deal agreed is less advantageous to Britain than what was before. And if that happens, maybe there will be an argument for a vote. I think it's problematic to have a second referendum because when 17.4 million people vote for something, I think it has to be accepted. And the difference between Owen Smith and Jeremy Corbyn, apart from the fact that Jeremy Corbyn's been a Brexiter all his life, is that he's probably right that if we say to people, when you are saying we want change, when you're saying you're unhappy in that many numbers, we're going to have another referendum. It's very dangerous for democracy. Next question. There's one back there. Mr. O'Leary.
So the premise was that people were just craving change. If it materialises that the change people wanted doesn't happen after Brexit, do you think that it's possible that it will swing towards people then craving change in the form of Jeremy Corbyn Labour Party?
Okay, so what this is about is what happens if the promises that were made by the Leave team, which included such things as 350 million for the NHS, that lots of people would be standing in the middle of Europe going, trade deal, have an advantageous trade deal. What if it doesn't happen? What if we can't get controls on immigration? What if the single market and we're going to lose money and lose jobs? What will happen? And Mr. Leary's question is essentially, will they then want another change? Possibly to Jeremy Corbyn's brand of socialism, which the country has never actually voted for into government in its life. And I think what I would say is that people are craving a change in their personal circumstances, and nothing will surprise me now as to what they would vote for. This was a bit simpler, I guess, because I think the EU was a very hard sell for people actually trying to say why we should remain in it, and Leave was an easier sell. The Remain campaign's press officer, head of press, said in December 2015, in focus groups, they were finding that every single person they spoke to knew all of Leave's arguments. This is 6 months before the referendum. None of Remain's. That's when they came back together, they decided to do Project Fear. They actually gave up trying to persuade people of the benefits of being in the EU. The point is that and my view, by the way, is that the referendum was lost before the referendum was even called. And it wasn't necessarily the campaign. I think people are looking for a change in circumstances. It's just whether the programme that Jeremy Corbyn actually comes up with in terms of policies, so he's pointed out the problems, can he come up with policies that make sense? And it won't probably be him, it will be his replacement, who might be someone more electable. But I wouldn't be surprised.
Owen has a question. Do you anticipate us leaving the single market because over 70 million people voted for changes in the immigration policy, and that's really the only way to bring it down?
So Erwin's question is, are we going to leave the single market so that we can have a change in the immigration policy? And it's a really important question, because Erwin then followed it up with something that Nigel Farage has said, that lots of people have said. The people voted for an Australian point system. The people voted for an end to immigration. No, they didn't. They voted to leave the EU. Yes, there are focus groups and polls that said the most important reason is to leave the EU. There are lots of people who voted to leave the EU because they wanted, when they go and vote for their MP, to be voting for the person that makes their laws, which isn't the case at the moment. They wanted us to be able to take back control of everything and choose the things we wanted. It wasn't just immigration. But to answer your specific question, do we have to leave the single market in order to get control over immigration? Probably yes. But there's a difference between being in the single market and having access to it. And with clever trade negotiation by about 4 people in this country with any experience of it, 'cause it's been about 40 years, but we are now hiring people from the private sector and people from Australia and New Zealand. With clever trade negotiation, and if we take it slowly and get it right, we might be able to find a balance. The thing is that, and again, this is something Nigel Farage has said, if people had voted for immigration, if there's ever a mandate for it, that's different from the situation now. Now we have this situation where people are coming into the country, changing the country, but the issue is that nobody voted for it. Let's have a situation where we make a decision. Alice has a question.
What do you think is going to happen to UKIP once the UK leaves the EU?
So Alice's question is, what's going to happen to UKIP once the UK leaves the EU? And there's 2 schools of thought on this. I think Nigel Farage has seen which way it's probably going to go. There's going to be a lot of people who study UKIP in the future and try to work out whether it was a one-person party. Nigel Farage left the Conservative Party in 1992, and this really is a question about him, in 1992 because he was so angry about the Maastricht Treaty and the ERM. He was only in his late 20s at the time. He is, whether you like it or not, the most successful politician of the last 25 years. No one else has set out to achieve something that seems so impossible and achieved it. And the reason he did it, and the reason why mainstream politicians couldn't deal with him, is that he wasn't in politics to be someone, he was in politics to do something. You may not agree with what he wanted to do, you may not agree with the way he did it, but people complain about, oh, they're all in it for themselves. He wasn't. He lost money, he got threats, and yet he managed to achieve a lot. He's now going to America to try and make money as a talk show host. If you want to really realise how good Nigel Farage is, within a month he got himself speaking at Donald Trump's rally, and Hillary Clinton did an entire speech ridiculing him. That takes skill. It depends who the leader is, Alice. Depends who they manage to get. It may be they can't find anyone else. And it may be that a lot of people who voted for UKIP to get this referendum and to try and get change will now say, okay, well, it's done now. We're going to go back to the mainstream parties. UKIP will now push for electoral system change, so they might have a chance. But they seem to be descending into even more chaos than Labour. So unless they find a decent leader, it's going to be very difficult. Mr. Gilbert. Excellent.
Thank you, Mr. Goldsmith. The gist of your argument is that the referendum was lost before it was called. That's, of course, a very controversial statement, because the referendum was won from Brexiteers only by a narrow majority. Nobody, including Mr. Farage, really could be sure about the result. So if you were presenting the counter-argument, which is that it was short-term factors that tipped the balance, what points would you mention?
I would mention that the Remain campaign was one of the worst political campaigns I've ever seen. I would mention that having a Labour Party leader who was a Brexiter and incapable of any inauthenticity, and I felt sorry for him at the time, didn't help. I would mention that the Conservatives didn't want to have anything positive about immigration because they said in reply to Will Straw trying to push them, let's make a positive case for immigration. Yeah, but we've got this issue with we promised less immigration in the tens of thousands, so we don't really want to raise that and have this discussion. Labour was afraid of talking about immigration as well, as it didn't sit well in the working class communities. They were up against a campaign in Leave that had practiced for about 20 years, and they were highly disciplined, highly on message, with everybody doing a particular thing very, very well. So there were short-term factors. It was a terrible campaign. Also, David Cameron's renegotiation proved that even though he was saying to them, if you don't give me this, we're going to leave, they still gave him basically nothing. I would argue he should never have tried to renegotiate at all, because all it did was allow the Leave campaign to say, even when we're threatening to leave, they've given us nothing. Imagine what will happen if we say we'll remain.
Tristan.
There was an article a couple of weeks after the referendum which said that David Cameron went to European leaders a couple of days before the referendum and asked for extra controls on immigration. What do you think the result would have been had he have got some extra leeway on that?
Okay, so Tristan was saying that David Cameron asked for some extra controls on immigration. In truth, and I'm not avoiding your questions, I'll come back to your question, it would never have happened because in order for that to happen, all 27 other countries would have had to agree with it. Once you do that, the whole bedrock of European Union, of freedom of movement of labour, would have been taken down. So it would have been almost impossible for that to happen. But let's say that had happened, counterfactual. Maybe small things might have made a difference. I still feel that, and a lot of people wanted to protest, I still feel they might have got enough people voting for Brexit, because I think people who made up their mind at the last minute and changed might have changed to remain because of the economic project fear, because of Joe Cox's death, because of other things. I think the key, and Mr. Gilbert said nobody predicted it, but Aaron Banks, who led the Leave.eu campaign, was the only person who was polling non-voters and had been saying for months this is going to be a Leave victory. He'd even predicted 52-48. I just don't think it would have changed enough people's minds, but it is so difficult for that to happen whilst remaining in the EU because it takes away a central foundation of what it is.